So the Russian Revolution of 1917 did not happen randomly. A huge number of factors were involved. Unlike Western Europe, Russia had remained a largely agrarian and semi-feudal economy. And among the wealthy intellectuals and students in Russia, you had a long-standing revolutionary intelligentsia that had formed and sought to modernize the country, overthrow the Tsar, and create some kind of either democratic or ultimately socialist government. And among the Russian revolutionaries, the first group that came into existence was called the Narodniks, and it means peopleists, but I mean it's often translated as populist, but that's not accurate. We understand populism differently than that, but it's the Narodniks. And the Narodniks were Russian students, intellectuals, who thought that the peasantry would be the basis of the revolution. They were known for going out among the peasantry. In some cases, they would dress like the peasantry to look as if they were peasants, and they would go to the peasants and try to incite them to rise up against their landlords. And actually, in some cases, the Narodniks started building communes. They would buy pieces of land and start running like cooperative farming and things like that. And actually, probably one of the most well-known intellectuals among the Narodniks was an anarchist named Peter Kropotkin. And he was kind of the intellectual of the Narodniks. And then there was a political party that was formed to follow the Narodnik ideology, and that was the Social Revolutionary Party. And they existed, and they believed that the peasantry in Russia would be the basis of the revolution, and the revolution would come about with the peasants taking control of the land, holding it in common, and having collective farming. That was the Narodniks. Now, in addition to the Narodniks, after that you had the emergence of another grouping that saw what the Narodniks were doing and said, look, the peasants aren't rising up, they're not revolting, we dress like them, we talk like them, but they don't want to revolt. So you had another grouping that emerged, and they were called the terrorists. And that was actually their name, by the way, that wasn't a slur on them, they actually called themselves the terrorists. And their idea was that instead of trying to go to the peasants and convince them to rise up against landlords and build communes, that what they would do is they would engage in acts of violence. For example, Tsar Alexander III was killed by a terrorist. The terrorist threw bombs at his carriage, killed him. The terrorists engaged in acts of violence, bombing, and assassinations. And the idea was that that would inspire the people to rise up. They would engage in terror, acts of terror, and the people would see these acts of terror and they would be inspired, and then they would rise up. It was to incite the masses. They would engage in acts of terror. And it was Marxism that emerged among the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. It was really the third ideological development. And Marxism came to Russia. It had been in Western Europe and France and Germany, and it came to Russia pretty late. And the difference that the Marxists had with the terrorists and with the Narodniks was that they didn't believe that it was the peasants that would make the revolution. They also didn't believe that acts of terrorism and violence would make the revolution. They argued that it was the factory workers and the industrial working class. In the Russian urban areas, you started to have the steel mills that were emerging and other factories, that they would be the ones to make the revolution. And they formed the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was part of the Second International. Marx had started the First International, and eventually it collapsed. And then there was the Second International, which was mainly centered around Germany and the German Social Democratic Party. And it was the world Marxist movement, like the Socialist Party of the United States was part of it. The British Labour Party eventually became part of it. It was the Second International. And the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was the Second International affiliate, the Marxist Party of Russia. And they existed, and they were very much a loose political association. To join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, you just had to say you agreed with some basic principles, pay your dues, and sign, and you were a member. And in 1903, Lenin argued that they needed a party of a new type. That the way that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was operating as this kind of loose association, that this was not sufficient. That in order to make a revolution, they needed what he called a party of a new type. And the very famous pamphlet that Lenin wrote, which is often quoted, called What Is to Be Done, was him arguing for the creation of this party of a new type. Lenin was basically arguing in his pamphlet, What Is to Be Done, that they needed a highly disciplined organization of people who gave, quote, the whole of their lives to the revolutionary movement. And many people look at this and they see this as kind of the distinction between the liberal revolutionary sentiments of Western Europe and the Eurasian traditions of Russia, right? Russia has a whole history of revolutionary secret societies and orders. They're like the Decembrists that were very famous. So they tried to bring down Tsar Nicholas I. You also have what was called the Old Believers. When the Russian Orthodox Church changed its rules and dropped a lot of its old rules, there's a group called the Old Believers. It formed a secret society with secret signs and kept the old teachings. And there's a long tradition of secret societies and revolutionary conspiracies in Russia. So in a lot of ways, you could argue that Lenin, with his party of a new type, was adapting Marxism to Russia's culture and Russia's traditions. And he argues in his pamphlet, What is to be Done, that essentially the party of a new type would engage in what he called propaganda and agitation. That first they would engage in agitation. Whenever there was an uprising among the people, or there was a strike among factory workers or a protest, the party would go there and it would agitate, and it would make it bigger. It would blow it up into a bigger uprising and have it expand. They would agitate by stirring people up to revolt against their conditions. But they would also engage in propaganda, which was the opposite. Agitation was just stirring people up to go out and fight against the old order, but propaganda was teaching people Marxism, right? And so they would agitate to the masses, and they would propagate to the advanced. They would find people who were smart enough to become communists, willing to become, and they would propagate to them and teach them Marxism. So they would engage in agitation and propaganda. They would build this party of a new type, and they would form what was called a central committee. And so Lenin basically approached all the prominent intellectuals and leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and asked them to join his central committee. It was like all of these leaders that we know about now, like Bukharin, Zinoviev, Stalin, all of them were very well respected. They were known for their writings, they were known for leading protests and strikes. And in order to hold the group together, Lenin came up with what he called democratic centralism, which was this idea that first they would have debate and discussion about what the right thing to do was, and after they made a decision, they would all be obligated to carry it out, right? So it would be broad discussion and debate, but then unity and action. If they ultimately took a vote and they decided we were going to do the opposite of what you wanted, you were obligated to keep doing what the group decided to do. It was democratic and centralist. And that was the way that Lenin got all these very, very well-known, sophisticated intellectuals to be in the same group. And another aspect of what he called democratic centralism was this idea that the party would have a united face to the masses. The disagreements within the party would only be inside the party. But when they approached the masses, they would all say the same thing. The disagreements were internal, and to the masses they had a unified face. And that was what was called democratic centralism. And so, Lenin convened this meeting in exile. I believe it was in London. He gathered all these all these prominent leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party together and pitched this idea to form a central committee for his party of a new type. And the majority of the people in the meeting agreed to follow Lenin, and the minority did not. And so the majority, they became the Bolsheviks, that's what Bolshevik literally means. It means majority. And so they started calling themselves the Bolsheviks, or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parenthesis, Bolsheviks. And those who didn't agree with it and wanted to keep with the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party's old way of doing things, they were called the Mensheviks, or the minority. So they were the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parentheses, Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks, they had a theoretical newspaper called Iskra, and that was where they laid out their Marxist ideas. That was their propaganda journal that explained their Marxist and communist philosophy. But then they had a daily newspaper that was their agitational newspaper, and it was called the Pravda. That means truth in Russian. And the editor of the Iskra, I believe, was Lenin. He was the editor of the Iskra. And the editor of Pravda was Stalin. And Pravda did not have Marxist ideas in it. It simply had stirring people up and encouraging them to go out and struggle. And actually, Pravda was known for anonymous letters. And they would print anonymous letters by workers about their factory, right? If their boss was treating them very badly, they would write an anonymous letter. Other people would read it. They would write in and say, yeah, my boss is doing the same thing. And it was a way of spreading the grievances of Russian workers and kind of making them well known. That was the Pravda. And then you had Iskra, where they were writing out their theoretical perspectives. Lenin eventually developed this thesis about capitalism had become imperialism, which was its highest stage. He argued that it was important for communists to support nationalism, even though Karl Marx had rejected nationalism. That was all being done in Iskra, and Pravda was the agitational paper. So that was 1903 when the Bolsheviks were formed. And then in 1905, you had Russia's first revolution, the 1905 revolution. And the way the 1905 revolution had begun, it was basically, as conditions were getting worse and Russia was facing kind of an economic crisis, people were getting poorer, wages were going down, conditions in the factories were getting worse, you had this priest named Father Gapon. And he was actually a police agent. He worked for the Tsar's police, but he was a well-known priest. And he was organizing the low-income and poor workers to have a march to the Tsar's palace to beg the Tsar to give more food to the poor people. Right? And it was a very religious march. It was asking the Tsar, on a kind of a religious, basis, can you please feed the poor? It was not a militant rally or demonstration, and Father Gapon was in touch with the Tsar's secret police the whole time as he was organizing it. At the same time, the Bolsheviks realized that Father Gapon had a big following. So on the day that Father Gapon called his big demonstration, January 22nd, 1905, the Bolsheviks had all of the unions that they were affiliated with go on strike. And so there was a strike all across St. Petersburg, and then Father Gapon had his peaceful march to the Tsar's palace, demanding, or not even demanding, just begging the Tsar, can you please feed your hungry people? Lo and behold, the peaceful demonstration was fired on by the military. They opened fire on it. At least probably about 200 or more people were killed. In response to that, there were uprisings all across the country. In the Navy, in the Tsar's Navy, sailors killed their officers and refused to obey, and there were strikes. And in St. Petersburg, they created a Soviet, which was a workers' council. They elected Leon Trotsky to be the leader of it. And it was temporary, and it was ultimately crushed. But it was what people called the dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution, was this episode of 1905. And that the Bolsheviks, they operated within this 1905 revolution. They had been part of it, they were organizing it, they were agitating and propagating, and they were engaging in it. And they argued that this was how the Bolsheviks learned to organize what eventually came later in the revolution of 1917. So fast forward to 1917. Russia was involved in World War I. Millions of Russian young men were on the front lines fighting against the Germans in World War I. And Tsar Nicholas II was on the throne, and he was viewed as largely incompetent. He was losing the war, and he was also kind of the laughingstock of Europe, because he had come under the influence of this guy named Rasputin, who was like a magician or something, and thought, he thought this guy had magical powers, and all of Europe was really laughing at the Tsar and how he was under the influence of this guy Rasputin, who was like a con man and a magician. And ultimately, it was other nobles who were so embarrassed that assassinated Rasputin in hopes of saving Russia's reputation. They were losing the war. So in February of 1917, and that's according to the Russian calendar, there was a strike by Bolshevik workers. They went on strike demanding, down with the Tsar, right? And usually when there was a strike, the police would rush in and just arrest everybody, and that was it. But this time, the police went in to arrest them, but then the Cossacks, which were like the cavalry, the mounted horsemen, they went in and protected the strikers. And in doing that, they sent out the message to all the workers across St. Petersburg that the military of Russia, the Cossacks, the mounted cavalry, they basically approve of you going on strike. So all over St. Petersburg and in other cities, everyone went on strike, demanding down with the Tsar and wanting a democratic government. And so the Tsar stepped down. At that point, it was pretty much a consensus, even among the richest people in Russia, that they wanted to get rid of the Tsar. The Tsar was incompetent, he was losing the war, they needed to get rid of him. But during the toppling of the Tsar, these Soviets, or these councils, they emerged once again to be the centers that the Bolsheviks were using to organize the people to resist the Tsar and to fight for their interests. So in the aftermath, you had Kerensky was appointed, and they started what they called the provisional government. The idea was eventually they'd have a constituent assembly, and it would be this new government that would be just kind of a regular capitalist democratic government. But there was a big division among the Russian capitalists at the time, among the wealthy people in Russia, because some of them were financially tied in with the wealthy corporations and banks of the United States and Britain. And they wanted to continue fighting in World War I and be an ally of the Americans and the British. But there were a large number of Russian capitalists that were tied in with the Germans. And they wanted to end World War I and stop fighting the Germans because they were tied in economically with the Germans. So there's this big division, right? Should we continue the war or should we not continue the war? So Lenin came back from exile, and he basically, that's where you get the peace, land, and bread, the slogan that we all know made the Russian Revolution. And the Bolsheviks were basically known as the anti-war guys. It was, if you're with the Bolsheviks, end the war. We want to end the war. I mean, it was peace, land, and bread, but peace was the main one. We are the party that wants to end the war. That was basically the message of the Bolsheviks. So as the year of 1917 is going on, you have the July days, there's a whole lot of strikes and uprisings demanding an end to the war. So then, among the military, you had this individual named Kornilov. And Kornilov was a general in the military. He wanted to continue fighting World War I. And he basically announced that he was going to overthrow Kerensky. And he was going to establish a military dictatorship, and that would continue World War I. And he was basically going to kill all the people that were opposing World War I, all the wealthy corporations and bankers that were tied to the Germans and all that. If Kornilov came into power, they were done. They were finished. So it was announced that Kornilov was going to take his army and march it to St. Petersburg, and he was going to declare himself to be the military dictator. And this army was coming. So the Bolsheviks, who were in St. Petersburg, started organizing all the people in St. Petersburg to build barricades and to get guns and to start protecting St. Petersburg from Kornilov, who was coming to take over and establish his military dictatorship. And it got to the point, the provisional government was so weak, they started opening up armories and handing the guns over to the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were the ones organizing this military defense of St. Petersburg against Kornilov. And it got to the point that the Bolsheviks' army was actually bigger than the army of the provisional government. So as Kornilov was marching, they got word that the city was so well fortified and the Bolsheviks had built such a big, effective army to beat back Kornilov that Kornilov turned around. Right? And he, in September of 1917, Kornilov turned around and he didn't attack St. Petersburg, didn't come in and declare himself a military dictator. And then, October, a couple months later, the Bolsheviks realized they were strong enough, they just seized power. They took over the telegraph offices and they took over the Winter Palace, and they announced that the Soviet, or the council that they had built during the revolution, that this Soviet was the new government. It became Soviet Russia. A couple years later, you had the Soviet Union. That's how the Russian Revolution happened. Not a lot is written about it. People often think of it in a very romantic way, but it was a series of long alliances that ultimately made it. And I wanted to just end, I don't want to get into too much about the Soviet Union here, but Lenin very famously said that socialism, that his definition of socialism is, he said it was Soviet power plus electrification, right? That it was, these councils that they had organized, these Soviets, if they could control electrification, which was cutting-edge technology, and bring, power and electricity to the whole country, and bring running water to the whole country, and make Russia into an industrial power on the basis of these Soviets. That's what socialism was. And Stalin is the one who ultimately carried that out with his 5-year plans. And the whole world watched as Russia went from being an agrarian, impoverished country to being a global superpower. The biggest hydroelectric power plants in the world. The biggest steel manufacturing apparatus in the world. They were the first country. Later, they eventually became the first country in outer space. So that all took place. That vision of Soviet power plus electrification was ultimately brought into being. And the Soviet Union had huge achievements in industrializing the country, despite the fact that they were constantly under attack. I mean, they were constantly surrounded. They had the Nazi invasion that killed at least 20 million people. But it was Soviet power plus electrification, and that's what made modern Russia what it is today. If Russia had remained a capitalist country, it would have stayed an agrarian, impoverished country. But they were able to industrialize it and all that with central planning and social